It's the How Games Make Money podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Grubb from GamesBeat.com. This is the show where I talk to people working in and around games and ask them, how does this business work? I try to put out a new episode every week or so, usually on Fridays. We'll see when this one goes out. I'm recording this on a Friday. We'll see. On this episode, this week I'm talking with Paul Croft and Dave Bailey from Mediatonic, which is sort of morphing into Tonic Games Group. Paul and Dave are co-founders of Mediatonic, which is an indie developer that does a lot of work-for-hire business. But now, the pair are building Tonic Games Group as an overarching publishing company to oversee multiple game-making labels. In our conversation, we talk about what it looks like to build a resilient studio, how live service games have enabled developers to thrive, and more. First, though, thank you for listening. You can get more from me at GamesBeat.com. Email the podcast at jeff.grubb@gmail.com with the subject line, How Games Make Money. Or reach out on Twitter. I'm at Jeff Grubb. The podcast is at HGMM Show. Okay, it's time to get to Paul and Dave from Tonic Games Group. Let's do that right now. Just going to let the music roll out, and then we'll roll right into the interview. Thanks a lot. Let's jump right into it. Okay, I got a couple of guests with me this week. First up is Paul. Go ahead and say hi.
Hi, everyone. I'm Paul, one of the co-founders of the Tonic Games Group and Mediatonic, and I effectively look after all of the titles that we do from a portfolio/slate perspective.
We also have Dave. Go ahead.
Hey everyone, I'm Dave. I'm also co-founder along with Paul and look after investor strategy and long-term business planning for Tonic Games Group.
So you are now Tonic Games Group, which is a new name for this new strategy. What was behind this change in direction?
Yeah, sure. And to understand that, really, you have to go back to the origins of Mediatonic and this journey that we've been on for some time. As you probably know, Jeff, we started Mediatonic back in 2005, and we've been on this journey initially building work-for-hire games, particularly in the online space. And over time, building the company up bit by bit, mostly organically, taking on bigger and bigger games, and being increasingly adventurous about what we were doing. But in the time between 2005 and 2015, the industry went through an enormous amount of change just as we were building our business. So aside from like the 2008 recession, we saw the peak of the console boom. We saw social games come and go on MySpace and Facebook. We saw the smartphone arrive and then become half of the entire industry. And so in that whole process, Paul and I got to like 10 years in and maybe 100 odd people in our business and started reflecting on, what do we want to do next? Where do we want to go now? We've made maybe 100 games, and we've seen all of this stuff happen around us in the process. And so the two big conclusions were like, well, we want to do more. We want to do more business models. We want to try making larger games and smaller games, but we're not necessarily the right shape for all of these things. And the second thing was, having seen so many studios come and go in that 10-year period, we were thinking, how can we fundamentally design to be resilient? And so those two thought processes are what led to a whole process of building new companies and business models. And we finally got around to giving all of that a name today, which is Tonic Games Group.
So, I mean, I think that's a fascinating subject. I'll just kind of start on there. Resiliency. The business of making games seems very volatile. Like you said, so many studios come and go, even over just a 10-year period. What do you think goes into making a studio that can last, beyond a decade?
I think one of the biggest challenges for game studios is, especially early on, they tend to be reliant on one or two projects. Like actually getting from 0 to 1 is incredibly difficult because of the hit-driven nature of the games industry. And so in our case, we were kind of lucky because our business model involved in the early days working for large publishers and getting paid to make games. And so on the one hand, we were obviously getting some money in the door and some cash flows and also building some skills and some capabilities. But we didn't own those games. And so each time a new project came along or a project ended, we were kind of starting again. And I think this is a very common problem for games businesses, particularly when they start building IP for the first time. And so in our case, our strategy, if you like, was, well, let's try and make more than one game. Let's actually try and make several games so that then you don't have this hand-to-mouth situation.
Is that why you guys are structured the way you are with several sort of sub-labels, right? Is that how it works, or am I misstating that?
Yeah, it is. So in the early days, as I say, we were doing the work for hire projects. And the natural step on from work for hire projects is to try and make more money from those games in the longer term. So maybe you worry less about making a profit margin during your game development and worry more about sharing royalties with a publisher once the game goes live. And so the first thing that we did was put a lot of effort into building out, if you like, this lifetime value partnership on the games. But we still weren't taking gigantic amounts of financial risk ourselves because there was a publisher involved. But as time went on, we wanted to do more of that. And so we started to invest in our own titles as well. And as that developed, we got to a place where really we had an additional business model, even an additional division. And at the point where we started really building Tonic Games Group behind the scenes, we decided to go further and start applying all the lessons that we'd learned and investing money in independent game studios too, basically an independent publishing business. And so all these models have been kind of layering up quietly behind the scenes to the point where we ended up with something quite multifaceted. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation in that we wanted those business models to sort of have some traction and be serious businesses in their own right before we did something like form a group where you have people at the center supporting all of these different arms. And we just reached that point now where, actually we've got 3 very different businesses with their own leadership teams and their own business models. And now we're trying to pull that together with something at the center to kind of make that our model going forward.
Gaming is always changing so much. I think when you just look at mobile gaming, I think it's become more stagnant recently. But for years, the business models would change from one to another. And it seemed like it was you couldn't ever rest on your laurels as a developer. Has that changed to the point where things maybe are more stable and you can make sort of more long-term strategies based on the way that you make money in gaming these days?
Yeah, it's changed so much. I mean, when smartphones first came about, I remember selling Amateur Surgeon for like $5 a unit on the iPhone. And then within a year or two, we had games like Angry Birds selling at 59p. And then a year or two later, actually, most of the games on the iPhone and on Android were free. I remember people like Peter Moore, EA, at the time talking about standing on a burning platform. And the games industry really had to get its head around this gigantic shift of like, okay, how do we actually welcome users into our game where we've probably spent money on them to get them in the door,
right,
and then find ways to keep them engaged. And that change has meant that game companies are really thinking about the very long term and how to keep people playing and how to provide new content and keep people interested, which requires completely different processes and technologies as well as different game design. But there's a big opportunity in that. The opportunity in developing games which have to last a long time for developers is that the developer becomes intrinsic to the success of that game. And so whereas 10 years ago, a publisher might have sort of picked up and let go of developers, once a game was finished and they could ship it and almost forget about it, suddenly the developer became intertwined with the long-term success. And that's been really key for us in that we've been able to take on games which then we're still running and growing 2 or 3 years later, which gives us a much longer term view on our revenues and predictability too.
Did you feel that change? Like, did it feel like, oh, this has the potential to enable us to understand about how much money we're going to make every month, every year, and we can build a long-term business around this? Was that something you noticed as it was happening, or is it like, oh wait, suddenly overnight you're like, oh wait, everything's changed?
Well, I think the first thing is it took ages to get good at it. Both publishers and developers spent a long time trying to figure out how to do this. And a lot of games failed in that process because the design process for a game that's going to last that long is, just completely different to, say, a cinematic experience with a start, a middle, and an end. And so I think that's why we saw quite so many studio closures and so much disruption in our first 10 years. But for us, a company that actually had a web games background, we had quite a bit of technology in this space already. We were already modifying games constantly from central platforms. And so we were a bit more prepared, even though we got buffeted by industry forces. And what we found was, yes, this gives us more predictable cash flows because we know for months on end we're going to be running these games. But also, as we got good at this, publishers started to say, well, actually, we want you invested in the long-term outcome of this game. And so we'll pay you royalties or other performance incentives to keep you motivated to do a good job here. And that really meant that as a developer, we could move on from, literally just getting paid in an agency model to make a game and start to behave more like an IP owner would, which is where the real change starts to kick in.
When you worked with publishers before and you were working as a work-for-hire studio, I'm sure a lot of the money came up front from them. Now, are you guys shifting away from that completely where you want to work on all your own IP and your own products? And then at that point, where does the money come from? Are you you have to take out loans, or do you have enough money coming in from other games where you're able to fund development? How does that work?
Exactly, yeah. So we've reached the point now where just over half of the revenues from our business comes in from the games themselves and from performance, which has been a transition that has probably taken us 3 or 4 years to make that happen and hit that goal. And obviously, where we want to get to is where the vast majority of our revenues is coming from either games that we own or effectively IP value that we have, whether that's royalties or whatever other mechanism. And really that just stems from, a desire really to want to be bought into the long term on games and wanting to be motivated by making the best game rather than just, trying to make some short term money really.
So this might be maybe a question more for Paul. What kind of games are going to succeed for Tonic Games Group going forward? Are they going to look different than what's succeeded so far, or maybe was working 5 years ago?
Great question. Yeah, I think there's common threads that run through a lot of our games, and it depends a little bit on which company in the group you're looking at or talking about. In terms of Mediatonic, Mediatonic is focused on a few distinct areas, but there's common threads that I think run through a lot of our games, and live services being one of them. So all of our games really are built to be run and managed over time as a service, no matter the sort of business model or structure of the game. So I think that's a common thread that we're going to see more of. We are gravitating increasingly towards large-scale multiplayer experiences, which you're seeing with Fall Guys, one of our upcoming games, and some of our mobile titles like Yahtzee, obviously focused around multiplayer, Gears Pop as well. So I think that's an ongoing trend that we're going to see more of. And when you are building games that you want to last for many years, having that is, it enables you to get out of a sort of content treadmill approach to running these games. So I think that's a positive trend.
I guess why is it important to have that portfolio approach, to have a diverse sort of lineup of games that can appeal to a wide variety of different video game players?
Well, I guess it's hard. When you have a portfolio, it offsets your risks a fair amount because you're spreading your risk across a lot of different games, business models, genres, and that gives you a lot of stability. And within the portfolio, the games are very diverse, and then the business models are diverse as well. So I guess, like we've spoken about with Mediatonic, our business model leans more towards, like Dave was saying, co-development, and we're bringing value to the proposition, and the publisher we're partnering with is bringing value to the proposition, and we're distributing the proceeds according to the value each of us brings, whether a publisher's bringing an IP or whether we're creating a new IP. That sort of tends to lend itself to a different business model. Whereas at the Irregular Corporation, it's more of a, I guess, publisher-focused business model in terms of, we're often taking the majority of the risk in terms of capital expenditure and that kind of stuff, and then distributing the revenues accordingly as well. So
how are you guys feeling about stuff like Xbox Game Pass and subscription models? And I guess just it does feel like we just got to a stable point where it's like, okay, we know how Steam's going to work, and we know how games sell on console, and mobile is now very clearly about free to play live service games, and then suddenly now subscriptions are coming in and sort of changing everything once again. Does that change the kinds of games that you guys are thinking about making, or is it something you're like, we'll figure that out later?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how the industry changes based on subscription models over the next few years. Obviously, it's changed things like the movie and the TV industry enormously with things like Netflix and now Disney Plus and the huge sort of platform war there. So I think there's definitely benefits for content creators, and there's things to bear in mind. And it's a little bit difficult to see how some of it will play out in terms of, for example, how subscription revenues are going to be distributed to developers and what that means in terms of game design. Ultimately, I think it will play out just to mean that engagement is going to be more important than ever, and retaining users is going to be more important than ever, and giving players value over the long term is going to be more important than ever. I think for content creators, it's really exciting because we've seen a sort of creative resurgence, I guess, in the TV space with Netflix and other platform holders coming in and suddenly creating a huge amount of new original content. And I think we are seeing and will see a similar sort of thing play out in games, really, in terms of these subscription services investing in creating content or acquiring content for their platform. And so to be a content creator, I think it's a great time. It's a great moment in the industry, and hopefully what we'll see will mirror that we've seen in the TV or music in some cases. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out. It's kind of hard to predict how it will map out over the long term. I think what we've seen in the games industry in the past is that when new things have happened, they haven't really edged out the old things. It's just made the overall market bigger. Mm-hmm. And I see that happening again with subscription services, where I don't think it will replace, say, Steam, but it will be another avenue where players can consume games and enjoy games, and that will work better for some people.
Does everyone at Tonic Games Group in the sub-labels sort of feel like even if things do continue to change, things have changed so much that you feel like we'll roll with the punches. No matter what happens, we're going to be able to figure this out?
Yeah, I mean, change is pretty much the only constant in the games industry. And in the last 15 years, I mean, like Dave said earlier, we started out making games on the web, and then things like platforms like MySpace. So the industry goes through a pretty major change every 6 to 12 months. We've got the new consoles coming out soon, subscription services, as you say. So yeah, things change all the time, and that's really been part of our design thinking in terms of how we've built the group and the companies, is that Mediatonic, for example, is quite unusual in that we haven't really specialized in a particular genre or type of game. And that's really part of our heritage in terms of we've walked between all of these various platforms and business models, and there have been common through lines that we've built over time. But I guess that ties back to our thinking really around resilience and building for the long term. We want the group to be going strong in, decades from now, really. And so to do that in the games industry, which is a very volatile space, you've got to take that into account.
With the subscription models in particular, it's brought some relief into the games community, not just because you've obviously got different tech titans vying for content, and so there's more money flowing, and I think better quality deals for developers available to create new IP than perhaps there was even 3 or 4 years ago. But from a game design perspective, it's freeing people up to think again more cinematically and to worry less about what's going on with the business models inside the game design, and think more about, some of the more creative things that they can play with. So I think that's been a particularly positive aspect. And I think when you think about the games audience today, we hear these stats like we did a few weeks ago, is 2.7 billion people playing games. Well, that's like a third of the population. So clearly there must be a huge amount of innovation that we can do, even with that existing audience size, to cater for people in different ways. And I think that subscriptions are already starting to push the boundaries there, because both developers and these subscription platforms are willing to try stuff out that maybe they wouldn't dare try out in conventional models.
Yeah, I find that's what I find exciting. Like, I think that there is still some trepidation about what this could mean, and is this going to push out even like very, very tiny developers that either can't get the meeting with Microsoft in the first place, or their games don't get played enough to meet some unknown metric that determines your actual payout from any of these platforms. But it feels like those are necessary growing pains to maybe get back to a point where the focus doesn't have to just be on the resiliency that we started this conversation talking about, where it's like, you focus on making games that can last for a long time and have that tend to focus on multiplayer. Maybe this is going to unlock a sort of game that was at risk of being lost. Now, are you starting to work on anything like that because of this, or is that still just something that might be up on a whiteboard?
We always have active discussions about where the industry's going and try and, because making a game takes a long time, right? So you've got to make it with a view to 2 or 3 years from now, what's the sort of industry going to be like? So we always try and, I guess, design things with a view to where we think things are going.
I think if you think about a game we released recently, Murder by Numbers, this sort of slightly crazy title where we're combining nonograms, this Japanese puzzle craze, with a detective mystery story, and this whole kind of crazy 90s theming. And it's an example of a game where someone internally, had a great idea, which was really fun, and it wasn't like anything that we'd seen before. We got to work with Hato Moa, who is a great game designer and illustrator. But like, if we didn't have a portfolio, I don't think we could have afforded, to take a risk like that and to invest in something like that. And I think that subscriptions have a similar kind of effect, where it's like, you don't have to worry quite so much about the commercials. You can start to do some stuff that's just a little bit different. And for Mediatonic in particular, one of our sub-labels, one of their values is embrace the weird and wonderful. And I think that's really important, because it's like, these kinds of models basically make that much easier and allow us to try stuff that's, a bit surprising and maybe a bit unexpected sometimes too.
When I looked over some of the announcements you guys were making when you were changing the name from Mediatonic to Tonic Games Group, a term you used was developer publisher. And I was wondering if you could explain exactly what that means.
I think, we may have coined a new industry term here, so I can get the trademarks in quickly. And the key thing for us is like, we wanted to have the opportunity ultimately to cover the whole value chain where that works for us. And so the ability, if we want to, for example, for the Irregular Corporation to publish a game developed and conceived by Mediatonic, or for Mediatonic to go ahead and build a game that's being commissioned by the Irregular Corporation and create these virtuous circles. And so for us, it's just about signifying that like we're crossing that threshold. We're not thinking about ourselves purely as a developer anymore. We're thinking much more around the audience, the longevity, and building those direct customer relationships. And so I hope that's the big change that you'll see from Tonic Games Group, as each of our individual labels now start to double down on, okay, well, who are we really making games for? and how do we seize that? That's really what it's about.
I'm very interested in Fall Guys, and instead of just like having you guys, tell me why that game's awesome, I think a lot of people get the idea like that's going to be a lot of fun when it comes out. I was wondering maybe you could talk me through building that game and making sure that it is designed in a way to thrive in the way that games work today. What were some decisions made along the way to ensure that this game is going to have the best chance for success?
You can do everything right during development, and it's still think the game still may fail or succeed. So, but we've thought about a lot of different things during development. I mean, really, what we're doing is thinking about how can we run the game beyond launch? How can we keep people entertained and engaged? And with Fall Guys, the game is really based around this concept of a game show, and so one of the things that we've built the game around is being able to release new content, new levels, new costumes for players on a regular basis so that the game is always changing and evolving, is always fresh and new. One of the other areas that we spent a lot of time thinking about is how accessible to make the game and how to make it very, very easy to pick up and play. So that's an area we've spent time in terms of how the controls work and how easy the controls are to grasp, the balance in the game between player skill and randomness. We didn't want to make the game 100% skill-based where, you could come in as a new player and just have no chance. We wanted to have an element of randomness, kind of much like a game show where you could come in and there is a chance for you to sort of make it to the top, make it to the end. So those kinds of elements we spent a lot of time thinking about. And then, it's all to do with how we run the game and manage the game live. So we also have a lot of sort of analytics and tracking in the game to sort of look at what players are enjoying, what they're not enjoying, and then we can double down and iterate on that through live operations.
Is this the kind of game where when you when it gets pitched early on, you could tell like there's something there, or is it like a dime a dozen? I mean, I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you can tell when you've got something special on your hands. And we actually pitched Fall Guys with a lot of GIFs of Takeshi's Castle, which made for a fun, it was a fun pitch deck. It was just a lot of people getting hit in the face with obstacles and things. But generally, it's a great way to test an idea is to share it with a couple of people you trust or a few people in the market and just gauge the sort of initial gut reaction. And for Fall Guys, it was great. We had a really good sense early on that we were on something really special, which was nice and so it was reassuring.
What's the future here? Is it continuing down the same path? Is it a lot of building up your own products while still doing some work for hire work? Is it maybe trending one way instead of the other? What's the future?
Yeah, so we've really been growing the portfolio quite a bit. So we've got about 13 unannounced titles at the minute. We're definitely trending towards at Mediatonic more of these large-scale multiplayer original games, and there will be more of those announced in due course. And we're going to keep working with some partners on the work for hire side where we've got really special relationships where we think that those games can really last a very long time. And then on the publishing side, we really have got pretty hefty pipeline coming through, particularly over the next year. So you'll see us really kind of just building out this pipeline and also just starting to engage much more in what the industry is doing and becoming part of the dialogue as well. Because until now, we've been so busy, we just had our heads down. We've not been talking at all about, what it is we're building here. And so hopefully, you'll hear more from us and we can get a bit more stuck in as well.
Well, Paul, Dave, it's been excellent to hear from you right now. I want to thank you both so much for joining me. It was a really great conversation.
Thanks a lot for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It's a pleasure.
Absolutely. Why don't we, is there anything you guys want to plug? Any games coming out very soon you want to tell people to go check out or a web presence, a social media presence you want to tell anyone about?
Well, I've just announced a few games. Paul, do you want to leap in?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of upcoming titles, the big ones in the next quarter or so are really Fall Guys, which is coming out summer this year. And then we've got on the Raid Corporation side a game called Mars Horizon, which is about building a space agency in the 1960s through to present day, and a game called Balsa, which is a model plane building game by the creator of Kerbal Space Program. So yeah, a couple of fun titles coming out pretty soon. And then I guess the main reference point is the Tonic Games Group website, presumably.
Right, yeah. All those games sound like exactly like my jam, so I'm excited. Yeah, well, once again, thank you both for joining me, and thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate that as well. We'll be back with another new episode next week. Until then, have a good one, and goodbye.